package was sitting on my front porch when I got home from my morning walk. I almost missed it. It was a small brown box, the kind you'd get from an online order, tucked against the door frame where the overhang kept it dry. My neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the street, and the autumn air carried that smell of wet leaves and wood smoke that always reminds me of better times. I picked it up without thinking much about it, turning it over in my hands as I stepped inside. Then I saw the label. My own handwriting stared back at me. My son's name, his address in Portland, and in red ink, stamped across the front, in letters that seemed almost aggressive in their finality, "Return to sender." I stood in the entryway for a long moment, coat still on, the package heavy in my hands in a way that had nothing to do with its actual weight. This was the birthday gift I had mailed 3 weeks ago, the one I had spent 2 hours picking out, carefully wrapped in the brown paper my wife always said made things look more personal. The one I had driven to the post office myself because I wanted to make sure it was handled right. It had come back to me, unopened. My wife came in from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. She took one look at my face and stopped moving. "What happened?" she asked. I held up the package. She crossed the room and took it from me, turning it over the same way I had. I watched her read the label. I watched her read it again. "The address is right," she said quietly. "I can see that. That's the address we've always used." "I know." She set the package down on the entry table very carefully, the way you set something down when you're trying not to drop it. Then she looked at the return label again, the one with my handwriting on it, and something shifted in her expression. She leaned closer. "Come look at this," she said. I leaned in beside her. She pointed at the label, at my own name, and our home address printed in what I had assumed was my own hand. And standing there with my reading glasses, finally doing their job, I saw what she had already noticed. That wasn't my handwriting. It was close. Very close. The same slightly left-leaning slant I've had since I was a teenager. The same way I make my capital letters a little larger than they need to be. But the sevens were wrong. I make my sevens European style, with a little crossbar through the middle, a habit I picked up from an old engineering professor in college and never shook. These sevens were plain, and the loop on my lowercase g was open at the bottom, where mine always closes. Someone had studied my handwriting carefully enough to copy it, but not carefully enough to get it exactly right. My wife straightened up and looked at me. "Someone wrote that return address," she said. "That isn't you." I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about my son, about the last conversation we'd had, almost 2 years ago, standing in this same entryway with voices raised and words said that I had spent 700 days wishing I could take back. About the way he had left without hugging his mother. About the Christmas cards that came back. About the silence that had settled over our house, like something physical. Something with weight and texture and edges you could bruise yourself against in the dark. His name is Daniel. He's 34 years old. He has my chin and his mother's eyes, and a laugh that, when things were good between us, could fill a room completely. He became a landscape architect, which surprised some people who remembered him as a quiet boy who preferred computers, but made perfect sense to me because Daniel was always someone who needed to make things grow. He needed to put his hands in the dirt and watch something come up from nothing. 2 years ago, he had introduced us to his girlfriend. Her name was Simone. I want to be careful here, because I'm 63 years old and I've learned that my first impressions of people are not always right, and that I have a stubbornness my wife has gently pointed out more than once that can cause me to decide about someone quickly and then spend too long defending that decision. So, I want to be careful. But from the first evening we spent together, something felt wrong to me. It wasn't anything specific. She was polite enough. She answered questions, smiled at the right moments, complimented my wife's cooking with the kind of precise, almost rehearsed grace that reminded me of a job interview. She was educated and well-spoken and clearly intelligent. Daniel watched her throughout that dinner with an attention that I recognized, the focused, slightly nervous attention of a man who is measuring the room's reaction to someone he loves. What bothered me was something smaller. It was the way the conversation kept finding its way back to her. Not forcefully, not rudely, but persistently, like water finding cracks. We'd be talking about Daniel's new project in Portland, and somehow we'd end up discussing Simone's perspective on urban design philosophy. We'd be laughing about a family trip we took when Daniel was 12, and she'd redirect us toward a parallel story from her own childhood. My wife caught my eye across the table once and gave me the small, almost invisible look that means, I see it too. After dinner, when Daniel helped his mother clear the table, and I was alone with Simone for a few minutes, she said something that stuck with me. She said that Daniel had told her a lot about our family dynamic, and that she thought it was important, as he moved into this new chapter of his life, for him to develop relationships that fed his growth rather than his obligations. I didn't know how to respond to that. I said something about how family and growth weren't necessarily opposites. She smiled and said no, of course not. But the phrase stayed with me. His obligations. Like his relationship with his parents was a debt to be managed, rather than a bond that existed for its own sake. Things changed slowly after that visit. Not dramatically, not all at once, in the way that would have been easy to identify and address directly. Slowly. Phone calls that used to happen every Sunday started happening every other Sunday, then once a month, then less. Text messages that I sent would be answered briefly, a day or two later, with responses that answered the literal question, but closed every door I'd left open. Plans to visit for then Christmas. Then Daniel called me on a Tuesday afternoon, about 8 months after that first dinner, and told me that Simone felt that his relationship with his parents was, in her words, emotionally enmeshed, and that he needed some space to figure out what his boundaries were. I was standing in my workshop when he said this. I had a piece of oak in my hand that I'd been planning to use for a small cabinet. I set it down. I asked him what that meant, specifically. I tried to keep my voice even. I told him I wasn't angry. I just wanted to understand. He used phrases I had never heard him use before. He talked about the need to prioritize his emotional ecosystem. He talked about patterns of expectation he'd grown up with that weren't serving him. He talked about learning to distinguish between love and control. I listened to all of it. And when he was done, I said, Daniel, I have never tried to control you. I have tried to know you, and those are different things. He said he needed some time. I said I loved him. He said he knew. Then he hung up. That was 22 months ago. I put the return package on the kitchen table and sat down across from it. My wife made coffee. We didn't talk for a while. Outside the window, the maple tree in the backyard had gone completely gold, all at once, the way it does every October, like it's trying to get your attention. Somebody intercepted it, I finally said. My wife set a mug in front of me. She sat down across the table with her own. It didn't get returned because of a bad address, she said. The address is right. It came back because someone wanted it to come back. And then they wrote the return label in my handwriting so it would look normal. So it would look like I'd mailed it to the wrong address or something. So Daniel would never know you sent it, she said. That sentence landed like a stone in still water. Because this wasn't the first thing I'd sent. I'd sent birthday cards, 2 of them, over the past 2 years. No response, but I'd told myself he was reading them and choosing not to reply, which hurt but was his right. I'd sent a short letter last spring, not demanding anything, just telling him about the workshop project and asking if he'd consider having a phone call sometime. No response. I'd sent a small box of photographs at Christmas, pictures from when he was young, because I thought maybe they'd remind him of something. None of those had come back, which meant one of 2 things. Either they'd been received and ignored, or they'd been intercepted before he ever saw them. I need to know if he ever got any of it, I said. My wife looked at me steadily. How are you going to find that out without calling him directly and having him think you're pressuring him? That was the right question. That had always been the tightrope I was trying to walk. I didn't want to be the thing she had called me, this overbearing presence violating his boundaries. I had spent 2 years being very careful, very measured, giving him the space he said he needed, while also refusing to simply disappear, because disappearing would have meant accepting a story about myself that wasn't true. But this was different. Someone forging my handwriting to return a gift my son didn't even know existed. That was different. I thought about it for the rest of that day. I went out to the workshop and stood among my half-finished projects and tried to think clearly. I'd been a structural engineer for 30 years. I knew how to approach a problem by breaking it into its component forces. What were the forces here? Daniel believed, or had been led to believe, that distance from his parents was something he needed for his own health. That was the frame Simone had constructed. Anything I did that looked like pressure would confirm that frame and push him further away. Any direct accusation about her would sound exactly like the controlling, enmeshed behavior she had already pre-explained to him. She had built the box before she needed to put me in it. That night, I called my old friend Gary, who I've known since we were both junior engineers at the same firm back in 1987, and who has, over the decades, become the person I trust most to tell me when I'm being an idiot. I explained the whole situation. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about Gary. When I finished, he said, "Do you have any of the other envelopes? The cards and letters you sent before?" I said no. They had just been regular envelopes, no tracking. This one came back with a tracking number? I looked at the box sitting on the kitchen counter. Yes. Then you have a record that it was delivered to that address and returned. That's something. I don't want to involve lawyers or make it into a conflict that... I'm not talking about lawyers, Gary said. I'm talking about whether you can find a way to reach Daniel that doesn't go through her. I thought about that. About what I actually knew about my son's life in Portland, who his friends were, who he worked with, what pieces of his daily existence existed outside of Simone's orbit. And then I remembered Marcus. Marcus had been Daniel's closest friend since they were both undergraduates at Oregon State. They had roomed together for 3 years, been in each other's weddings, though Daniel's marriage had ended before we'd even met Simone. Marcus was a good man, steady and loyal in the way of people who have never needed to perform their reliability because it's simply who they are. I had his number somewhere because we had exchanged it years ago at Daniel's request, for practical reasons I couldn't now remember. I found it in my old contacts. I stared at it for a long time before I decided what I was going to do. I didn't call him that night. I sat with it. My wife and I ate dinner and watched something on television that neither of us paid attention to, and at 10 o'clock she went to bed and I sat in the living room with the lights low and tried to think about my son as clearly and honestly as I could. Because here is the thing that I had to keep checking myself on. Was I right? Parents are not always right about their children's partners. I know that. Children pull away from families for legitimate reasons, sometimes. Families are not always the safe and nurturing places they appear to be from the inside. I had run through my own history with Daniel, carefully, painfully, looking for what I might have done that justified the word she'd used. Enmeshed, looking for ways I had tried to control rather than connect. And I didn't find nothing. I found some things. A period when Daniel was in his mid-20s, when I'd been too quick with advice he hadn't asked for. A conversation about his first job offer where I had pushed harder than I should have for a position that would have brought him back to our city instead of the one he actually wanted. Moments where love and preference had blurred together in ways that weren't fair to him. But I also knew the difference between a father who sometimes struggled with letting go and a father who had done something to deserve 2 years of silence. I knew the difference. I called Marcus on a Thursday morning, early, while my wife was at her water aerobics class. He answered on the second ring. "I was wondering if you'd call," he said, which told me everything about how much he already knew. I asked him directly, was Daniel okay? And had he received anything from me over the past 2 years? There was a pause that lasted long enough to feel significant. "He's okay," Marcus said carefully. "I think. I don't see him as much as I used to. Simone and I don't really." He stopped, started again. "We got off on the wrong foot early on, and it's never really recovered." "Does he know I sent him things?" I asked. "Cards, a letter, photographs at Christmas, and a birthday gift this month that got returned to me." Another pause. "A birthday gift," Marcus repeated. "It came back with the return address written in what looks like a copy of my handwriting," I said. "Which means it wasn't a delivery error." I heard Marcus exhale slowly on the other end of the line. "I didn't know about the gift, but I can tell you that about a year ago, Daniel mentioned to me that he was surprised his parents hadn't even sent a card for his birthday. I told him I was sure you had." He kind of shrugged it off. The kitchen felt very quiet around me. The refrigerator hum seemed very loud. "He thinks I haven't been in contact," I said. "I think," Marcus said, "that's what he's been led to believe. Yeah." I gripped the phone. I breathed. I did not say the things I was thinking because they wouldn't help anything. "Marcus," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me even if the answer is hard. Is there anything about how I was as a father, anything real, that would give Daniel a legitimate reason to cut contact with me? Not her version. The real version." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Honestly, no. You weren't a perfect father. Nobody is. But Daniel talked about you guys with real love. Always. Right up until Simone. The change wasn't gradual. It was like a switch." We talked for another 40 minutes. Marcus told me things carefully, in the way of someone who is loyal to multiple people and trying to honor all of them. He told me that Simone had, over the 18 months since she and Daniel had moved in together, systematically reduced his contact with essentially everyone who had known him before her. That Marcus himself was now lucky to get lunch with Daniel every couple of months, always without Simone, always with the slightly pressured feeling of borrowed time. That 2 of Daniel's other close friends had stopped trying altogether. That Daniel's former work mentor, a man he'd spoken about with deep respect, had mentioned to Marcus that Daniel had stopped returning his calls. "It's a pattern," Marcus said. "I've thought about it a lot. I just didn't know what to do about it that wouldn't push him further away." "I know," I said. "That's been my problem too." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Outside the window, the maple tree had lost half its gold leaves overnight. They were scattered across the lawn in the early light, bright and particular, against the dark grass. I thought about a morning when Daniel was 9 years old and had come into my workshop while I was building a bookshelf. He didn't say anything, just pulled up the small step stool he'd claimed as his own and sat watching me work. After a while, he asked me why I measured everything twice before cutting. I told him that wood doesn't give you second chances, that you had to be sure before you committed. He'd thought about that very seriously in the way he thought about everything at 9 years old, and then he'd said, "What if you measure wrong twice?" I'd laughed and told him that was why you also trusted your eye. I missed him with a specificity that felt almost physical. Not the idea of him. The actual specific person who had sat on that step stool and asked that question. My wife came home from her class, and I told her everything Marcus had said. She sat down and listened, and when I finished, her eyes were bright, and she blinked a few times, and then she said, "So what do we do?" "I need to find a way to reach him that she can't intercept," I said. "And I need him to understand that the silence has been manufactured, that I have been here the whole time. If you go to Portland," she started, "if I show up at his door, she'll frame it as exactly what she's told him to expect. Boundary violation. Harassment. She'll have her explanation ready before I get up the steps. Then it needs to be something he finds himself," my wife said. "Not something delivered to him, something he discovers." I thought about that. Something he discovers. Marcus had given me one piece of information that I kept turning over. He had told me that Daniel, despite everything, had kept one habit from his old life. Every Saturday morning, he went alone to the same coffee shop near his office to read and work on personal projects. Had done it for years. Simone didn't go. It was, Marcus said with some significance, one of the few hours Daniel reliably spent alone. "I am 63 years old, and I have not done many impulsive things in my life. My wife would tell you I err significantly in the other direction, that I will think through a decision until the decision makes itself out of sheer exhaustion. But I booked a flight to Portland for that Friday night. I told my wife what I was planning to do. She looked at me for a long moment. "You're not going to confront him," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm going to be there," I said. "He can choose what to do with that." She packed me a bag without another word, which is its own kind of answer. I want to be honest about what that Saturday morning was like, because it wasn't cinematic. I arrived at the coffee shop before it opened and sat in my rental car and felt, with great clarity, like a foolish old man on a misguided errand. I went over every way this could go wrong. He could leave immediately. He could be angry. He could be cold in the way that's worse than angry, the way that treats you as a stranger. Simone could be with him despite what Marcus had said. The coffee shop opened at 7. I went in at 7:15 and found a small table near the window and ordered a coffee I didn't need and waited. At 8:45, my son walked through the door. He looked good, thinner than I remembered, with the beginning of the same gray at his temples that I had at his age, which struck me with a small private grief for the time I hadn't been there to watch arrive. He was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize and carrying the same worn leather messenger bag he'd had since graduate school. He went to the counter without looking around the room, ordered with the ease of someone giving a familiar order, and then turned to find a table. He saw me. I had thought about what I would do in this moment. I had decided I would not stand up, would not wave, would not do anything that could be read as pressure or demand. I would simply be there and let him make every choice. He stood very still for a moment. Then he walked over to my table and stood across from me and said, "Dad," just that word. But the way he said it, like he'd been holding it somewhere and it had found the exit. "Hi, son," I said. He sat down. We were quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. I looked at him and tried not to make it too obvious that I was looking at him the way you look at something you've been afraid you'd never see again. "How did you know I'd be here?" he asked. "Marcus." He absorbed that. He didn't seem angry about it. "How long have you been in Portland?" "Since last night." He looked up. "You flew out just to—" "I flew out because I need you to know something," I said. "And I couldn't think of a way to tell you that would reach you, because I don't think the things I've sent you have been reaching you." I watched his face carefully when I said that. "What do you mean?" he said. I told him about the birthday package. I had brought it with me, still sealed, and I set it on the table between us. I watched him look at the return address label and frown. I explained what his mother had noticed, the 7s without crossbars, the open loops. I watched him lean down and look more closely. "That's not your handwriting," he said, slowly. "It's a good copy," I said. "But no." He sat back. Something was moving behind his eyes that I recognized. I had seen that look when he was a teenager and was being forced by evidence to revise something he'd believed. "I also sent a letter last April," I said. 2 birthday cards, one for each of the past 2 years. A box of photographs at Christmas." He was quiet. "You thought I hadn't been in touch," I said. "Not an accusation, a statement." He looked at me for a long moment. "She said," he stopped. "I know what she said," I said gently. "I know what she told you about me, about us. And I've spent 2 years asking myself whether any of it was true, trying to be fair about it." "Dad, I'm not here to tell you she's wrong about everything or to make you choose," I said. "I'm here because my handwriting on that package is not my handwriting, and I need you to know that I have been here the whole time." Daniel looked down at the package on the table. His coffee was getting cold beside him. "I thought," he said quietly, "that you just decided to give up." The words hit me somewhere I don't have a good name for. "I would not give up on you," I said. "I don't know what else I can tell you except that. I am your father. I don't get to give up." He didn't say anything for a while. I didn't push. I let the coffee shop happen around us, the other conversations, and the coffee grinder, and the sound of the street outside. Finally, he said, "She monitored my mail for a while. I knew that. I told myself it was because she was worried about." He stopped again, pressed his hand flat on the table. "There were a couple of things early on that she said were from creditors that turned out not to be. I found the original envelopes in a bag in the back of her closet." He looked up at me. 6 months ago, "Daniel, I didn't do anything about it," he said. "I told myself I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. I told myself a lot of things. I thought about what Gary had said to me once, years ago, about the stories we tell ourselves to make peace with things we haven't found the courage to face yet. I thought about how that wasn't weakness. It was just being human. You don't have to do anything right now," I said. "You don't have to make any decisions or have any big conversations. I just needed you to know that your mother and I have been thinking about you every single day for 2 years." He picked up the package from the table, turned it over in his hands the way I had turned it over on the porch. Then he looked at me and said, "What did you get me?" And there it was. Under all the weight and the grief and the complicated hard work still ahead of them both, just, "What did you get me?" Like he was 12. like the maple tree still had all its leaves. I told him I'd gotten him a book on sustainable landscape design that I'd read a review of in a magazine, and that I'd also included the pocket knife I'd had since I was 25, the one he'd always admired in my workshop, because I'd decided it was time it belonged to him. He was quiet for a moment. "The Opinel," he said. "The wooden handle one. That's the one." He didn't open the package right then. He set it carefully on the seat beside him, like something that needed to be treated well. We sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours. We didn't resolve anything about Simone, and we didn't have the conversations about what comes next. Those would come later, and they would be difficult, and they would require Daniel to do things I couldn't do for him. I knew that. He would need to look clearly at his own life and decide what was true and what had been constructed for him. And that kind of seeing is some of the hardest work a person does. But for 2 hours, we talked the way we used to, about his projects in Portland, a park renovation he was proud of and wanted to explain in detail, a community garden installation that had run into soil contamination problems he'd had to solve on the fly, about a documentary I'd watched recently about old-growth forests that I thought he'd like, about small things that had happened to his mother that I described and he smiled at. When we finally stood up to leave, he hugged me. Not the brief, back-patting hug of someone going through emotion. He held on. "I'm sorry," he said, against my shoulder. "You don't need to be," I said. "Just come home sometime. Your mother wants to make that soup you like." He laughed. It filled the space exactly the way I remembered. On the flight home that night, somewhere over Northern California, I looked out the window at the dark and the distant lights below and thought about what my wife had said when I called her from the coffee shop parking lot, still a little undone, not quite trusting what had just happened. She had listened to everything, and then she'd been quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I knew he didn't forget us. I knew it the whole time." Some things you hold on to not because you have evidence, but because letting go of them would mean letting go of something true. My wife held on to that for 2 years. I tried to. There were nights I didn't manage it, nights I sat in the dark workshop and thought about the oak cabinet I'd never gotten around to finishing and felt something close to despair. But the morning I had walked up to the porch and found my own package sitting there, something I had sent out into the silence come back to tell me something was wrong. I had done what my old professor taught me and what I'd passed on to my son without knowing he'd remember it. I measured twice. I trusted my eye, and the wood, this time, gave me another chance.